I just wanted to welcome to the stage Daniel Vince and Lewis Walker, who are the co-founders of Tendry Studios, and then Gavin Cunningham, who is the CEO of Rebel Studios. He's also the mailroom assistant. And so this should be interesting. Thanks a lot, guys. Great. So let's start with some intros. Gavin, you want to kick it off?
Yeah, nice to meet you. My name is Gavin Cunningham, CEO of Rebel Studios. We are a UK-based entertainment startup focusing on content purely designed for Web3. So do I quickly, or how do you want? Do you want me to do an intro, or do you want to say hello?
Go ahead and give an intro of what Rebel Studios is, what you aim to solve.
Yeah, so we essentially, our kind of thesis is that the next kind of Marvel or Star Wars property will be built on a Web3 platform. We have a bit of a thesis that technology is reaching an inflection point, and that will change the way that we experience stories as society with profound consequences. I'll go into that in a second. And we are developing content specifically for that. We basically put a load of Web 2 storytellers, interactive storytellers together, and gave them a bit of a strange mission, basically. And our first project is called Icon, which is in development. It's an interactive story world, but I will hand over and come to a minute.
Great. Do you both want to introduce yourselves and talk about Tendry?
Sure. So, thank you for coming, guys. My name's Lewis. I'm co-founder of Tendry Studios. We're a small UK-based startup based on the Wax blockchain, which surprised me this week as it's being more known about than what I thought previously, but obviously compared to the Matic and the Ethereum stuff, it's very small currently. Our sort of flagship game at Tendry Studios is a game called Zos, Zombie Outbreak Survival. I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point, or you can come grab us and talk about it today. But it's essentially an MMORPG resource management style game that is sort of zombie themed. And obviously telling that zombie story, we can make a lot of sort of iterative. If you think of like Walking Dead, you start off at the start of the season where you're fighting the zombies, and then you get like down to like season 10, and the zombies aren't a thing anymore. You're fighting the people, but there's the whole road that they've taken to get there. That's the sort of thing we're trying to capture with Zos, and we're doing that in a way that is backed by the player ownership, asset ownership, and provability of blockchain and smart contracts. So I'll hand over to Deej.
Great to see you all. I'm Deej. Me and Lewis both founded Tendry Studios about 18 months ago now. The idea came about, and we worked on the development of our flagship game, as Lewis has alluded to. And the one thing that we really focus on is the idea of ownership within the storytelling with your assets. And what traditional games do really well is, obviously, when we look at the evolution of gaming, and it went from being very much isolated experiences to then like you had story modes, main characters, your favorite weapons, your favorite guns, your favorite in-game items. We really focused on trying to bring that concept that traditional gaming has done really, really well to early Web3. And we noticed that a lot of people were doing the early evolution of gaming with these isolated experiences, but nothing really followed any kind of flow in terms of storytelling. It was a lot of game mechanics, but no gaming. So we designed Zos to fill that gap with a storytelling mechanism that we call eras. And that was what Lewis is alluding to with the idea of seasons within like The Walking Dead, where Era 1 is very much you're fighting against your neighbors because they've now, become undead, and you're grabbing your nearest shield, picking up your...
Neighbors are trying to eat you.
Picking up your weapons and just fending off for your life. And then obviously we then touch on the idea of supply chain has now stopped. We've got to go and find food. We've got to develop new weapons, craft new barricades, defense mechanisms, and then seek refuge in different strongholds and buildings. And then desperate people and hungry people become the #1 enemy, and zombies become like the byproduct of this new apocalyptic world. And that flows really nicely through these eras. And with a new era comes new gameplay, new game mechanics. And we're bridging that gap between the Web 2 storytelling and the Web 3 gaming experiences with player ownership. And I think that's really important.
This is really exciting. I wonder if there are technical challenges specific to Web3, or is it just that we're just at that point in the history where people just haven't developed stories? Gavin, you want to comment on that?
There are definitely technical challenges with using Web3 in storytelling. The UX is crap. Sorry, generally it is. It's clunky. You've got security issues. It really depends on how kind of you're trying to use it. Also, managing, enabling a community has challenges, and there are kind of different ways to approach it. Like, I'm not a big believer in storytelling by committee. I think it's an art form. I meet some of the storytellers I've met kind of on this journey are just like, it's a whole language, like it's a whole art form. These guys are like incredible at their craft. I don't know if we all want to tell a story together and know the outcome, right? I'm a bit more like, I want to experience it. I want to be part of it. I think people want to affect the outcome, but I don't think you want to know what the ending is before you start. Personally, that's my.
I can sort of see that. So something I really like personally in traditional games is a sort of you make your own fun kind of game. You know, the game gives you the tools. Take Minecraft, for example. It gives you the tools to play, but what you actually do within the game, so long as you follow a certain trajectory, you're making your own fun along the way. And I think that's something that, because NFTs are, you know, they're generally unique and they're owned and everything, you can really make your own story and just sort of follow the general flow of a story within a game. And you know, if you own, say, a character in our game, for example, all the characters are unique, like most NFTs are. You could trade that character between people, and not only would you have your own individual experience of playing a game, but you'd see that characters, then that playable assets experience as that asset has traded hands. And oh, you know, he sold for a lot of money at that point, or he did a lot of supply runs at that point, which is a game mode of ours. And so you can almost interweave these little stories as well and make your own fun that way.
I mean, it's almost like the traditional sense of, you have the main storyline, then you've got side quests, and then you've got like an achievement hunter as well that goes out of the way to try and do certain goals and objectives, and some of those achievements are hidden. And we're really trying to guide the players down this storyline, but also let them have their own creativity in terms of sort of like the metadata that sits behind the NFTs. And one thing that we've noticed as players on Wax and users on Wax is the story behind the platform itself. And, you know, we've met with several people this week from the Wax community that we've obviously never met before, and we're just internet friends. And the first things that we're talking about is like pivotal moments in the Wax community where this milestone crazy thing happened, or can you remember when this happened, or when this was released, and when that user did this, and that was found, and that's what we're trying to bring into our game. So one of the future concepts that we're currently developing at the moment is it's a mass community v community PvP concept, all powered by the blockchain and running in real time, which will essentially be a building versus building game mechanic where people can stake their survivors to the building to get extra in-game benefits and buffs, but then also that building can wage war on another building of another 100 community members, and let's say that community is being led by an influencer in the space, and this community is being led by a different influencer in that space, and then they can essentially go to war in real time. Assets will be destroyed. You know, there'll be huge gains, huge losses in terms of these battles, almost like an EVE Online concept. And the stories that will sit behind that for years to come, where people are saying, oh, can you remember when the Any Observation took on the Sammy Snake community in that huge war that cost $15,000 in terms of assets being destroyed, but ultimately the Any Observation won that battle. So not only are we providing a storyline from like a development studio point of view, but then the communities will also be writing their own stories within the community itself, which we think's a layer that the community can bring to Web3 that we don't really have on Web 2. Because once something happens, we sort of forget about it, whereas here we can prove it on chain.
Great. So I want to shift, Gavin. You had a long career before getting into the Web3 space, and you had the chance to kind of survey all of the technologies and decide what you wanted to, where you wanted to dig in. Why this?
I started life as a corporate lawyer, and I remember at the age of about 23 trying to figure out how, if everybody bought a Coca-Cola owned a piece of Coca-Cola, whether Coca-Cola would have growth and network effects. So that has always been something that I've found personally interesting. Just a different way of approaching ownership and a different way of approaching, of kind of disintermediating the difference between your fan base and your shareholder base. If you look at traditional kind of Web3 corporate structures, you establish an investment vehicle, you raise a bunch of money, and then you focus on your fans or your kind of user base, and your job, your obligation under law is to extract as much value from your users as possible and distribute it back to your shareholders. Now, what's super interesting for me about NFT communities and models is that we are starting to see the beginnings of a different approach of like participation in a brand and participation in a story. We're looking at kind of NFTs and sort of blockchain as a coordination systems. I don't know whether we're just off on a tangent of our own or we're thinking kind of slightly differently, but I kind of got into blockchain as a lawyer about 2017, and we were looking at kind of building stuff, basically. First time I came across NFTs as a concept was probably about 2018, and we were looking at using, it's just individual tokens pointing to something, right? But we were looking at invoices moving around supply chain systems as a coordination system. And you have to kind of break down what blockchain actually is, right? It's middleware. It's a common system of record that's usable as middleware. I think what's really, really interesting for us is how does that enable us to make or to turn something different into a game? And I'll give you kind of an illustration. Like one of our lead writers is this magnificent chap by the name of Sean Stewart, and he invented a concept about 20 years ago for Spielberg when they released artificial intelligence. And this became known as an alternative reality game. What they did is they created a world in which artificial intelligence existed. Like a murder mystery, basically. And then they broke that into 1,000 pieces and hid it all over the internet like a treasure hunt. And then they put these like glitches in the clues. And if you saw the glitches, you're like, is that a phone number? And then somebody called the number. And then they would, like, in this whole kind of like just world unveiled, where people were like, wow, it was just a really interesting kind of sort of community, but also kind of developing art form. Like it's a purely online art form. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating. But what really got me interested was when you looked at some of the community behaviors behind ARGs. People would be in smaller groups. They would go out. They would solve puzzles or kind of create mysteries. They would find information, and they would bring that back into the group and share it. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting, because that is some of the consumer behavior that you see around NFT groups and crypto groups in particular. So we thought, wow, this is really interesting. I'll go on a rant about where I see storytelling going on in a minute, but what we then thought, it was like, this is really interesting. Like, that kind of alternative reality experience never had a coordination system before, so it's only ever been used as a marketing tool. I Love Bees is an interesting one, which was the origin story for Quake 2, if you want to have a look at it, but it had 2.5 million players. I think what is interesting for us is like, okay, so if we're using the blockchain as a common system of record and open middleware, does this allow us to take a game off the board? I know this is a bit of a weird concept, but let's look at chess, right? It's inscribed on a piece of wood. And they're the parameters of the game, and you have to kind of play on that. Then you have, take anything, like go from board games, and then you go to, oh, I'm building on Steemit, I'm building on this, I'm building on that. They're all within like set parameters. And so you can extract assets, you can put back, but they're all set within set parameters. But what we didn't see is anybody using what was fundamentally a system of record and shared logic, well, whether you put logic on it or whether you kind of use it as kind of just system middleware for a shared system of record. But we didn't see anybody using that as a way to coordinate something that would otherwise not be possible as a game. And that's what we thought would be really interesting to kind of explore, because what we're seeing is an entire change in the way that society experiences and uses stories. And so we thought, do you know what? We're going to track that way. Anyway, I'll hand over because I've gone a bit of a rant.
No, that's great. I'd love to hear your origin story as well. What made you, believe that this was the point you wanted to solve?
So we've been gamers in the traditional sense, obviously since basically coming out of diapers, and then that sort of leads into like definitely for me, like the era of collectibles as well. So Pokemon cards, Yu-Gi-Oh cards, like physical collectibles, and Funkos, etc. Which then led me down the rabbit hole of finding Web3 and NFTs, and then taking that collecting hobby into a digital form. And then whilst I was not only collecting on Web3, then we started playing games on Web3. And like I say, it was very much isolated experiences. Nothing held any sort of substance other than the fact that it was very early, and it was, okay, this is a way that we can play and also make money. And although the play-to-earn aspect of ownership is important, I felt that there was something missing in terms of traditional gaming and collectibles. And that was
What I always say is that crypto is a game. It's a game type.
Yeah.
But it's not the big gaming world.
Not yet.
Not yet. It will be, but it's not yet.
I personally believe, and we believe this as a business and as a studio, that whether we as a studio and then hundreds of other indie studios drive this forward, or if traditional studios like EA, Blizzard, Activision see the player base and the hive mind of the players changing towards, well, I do want to own my assets. I am fed up of playing microtransactions and having nothing to show for it when the new season comes out. And I believe that shift is now changing. And that's going to be the pivotal point in which the Web3 can take control of the gaming space, backed by crypto, backed by ownership, backed by provability, and say we're not willing to just keep funding these corporations with billions of dollars every year on repeatable storytelling and games that change ever so slightly on an annually basis, to where the players then have to reinvest. It's not just $80 for a game, it's now $80 plus $500 in microtransactions just to be able to be competitive. And Web3 kind of bridges that gap by saying that asset is yours forever, in verbatim, and we can transfer that over to the new game model, and we can provide the players with an opportunity that when they do eventually stop playing and life takes them in a different direction, they'll be able to then trade that on the marketplace and either recoup more than what they put in, or a fraction of what they put in order to then take that money and do something else with it.
And the NFTs themselves will create stories.
Oh, for sure. So one of the things that the previous talk touched on was the Leroy Jenkins meme from World of Warcraft. And essentially, the best way that I tried to explain NFTs to my mum was, could you imagine if you could track every time that a Pokemon card had been traded hands, and prove who's owned it at any one time, how valuable that data would be. And through obviously like the pandemic and COVID, we saw celebrities picking up cards, as like a hobby whilst they were all locked in their houses. And there's some real pivotal people that own those cards that have probably sold them now. And you wouldn't be able to track that card was owned by that very specific person unless you had some kind of system of record. And so if we can prove that, then not only does the game itself that the assets are used on have a story, but then the asset themselves has their own personal story, and you can track that, on the chain, and that in itself holds weight and holds, merit in terms of, let's say, you was looking at League of Legends, skins were all NFTs. And a very specific skin was used to win one of the championships, and then that player decided to retire and sell his assets. How much would those skins be worth, and where would they travel for the next 10, 15 years? And, people would go hunting for those skins. Mm-hmm. I think that's important.
Yeah, definitely. It's like buying Madonna's boots or something.
Exactly, yeah.
I would love to hear you continue on what you said you had NFT storytelling tidbit rant.
Yeah, I suppose just kind of a final thought for me, unless anyone has any questions, of course, is why is this important, basically? I think
we're all kind of in this because we have a sense that we're at an inflection point, essentially, a societal inflection point, and there is a change. I'm going to give you a bit of a theory as to why. And basically, I studied language originally before I went into law and then technology. But there was an interesting kind of theory that I remember kind of learning, and it was that a society transforms based on the technology which enables it to store and record information as text, to tell stories. And I'll give you an example. Like a tribal society is limited to, in the oral tradition, what people can remember, right? Society can't grow beyond. There's no property, there's no institutions. All property has to be owned by the king or the chief. Once you have the ability to write something down, that society can grow. That society can have institutions, it can have laws, it can have property, it gets bigger and bigger. And that's kind of where we grew up till basically the invention of the printing press by William Caxton in 1160 or something like that. But what that meant is that the ability to disseminate information or disseminate stories became very cheap. You had education, you had news, you had books, you had a whole kind of growth, right, in societal kind of development. Now, the next inflection point for human society came much later, which was the invention of the internet. And you'll kind of know, you'll have this sense, your mum, you're like saying, I'm trying to explain NFTs to my mum. The truth is, if mum can't use the bloody internet now, she's not literate, right? She does not have the ability to access information. And that is basically the definition of literacy. So we're at an inflection point. But if you look at the first version of the internet, our kind of Web 1, basically it was taking the traditional institutions, right? Institutional narratives, centralized news services, like older products, and just selling them down a better distribution and coordination system. That's what it was basically used for. But the version of the internet that we're seeing starting to evolve now is very different, right? We've all observed that people are distrusting common sources of information and that stories are becoming much more fragmented, right? We are starting to trust influencers. Basically, this is a reversion back to the tribal. We trust somebody that tells us information. We are not basically trusting a central news source. And I suppose my point is that technology is now enabling something which is not a breakup. I'm going to suggest to you the idea that we are basically reverting back to our natural human tribal way of sharing stories, which is fragmented, person to person. And that is going to be the kind of future of the way this goes. I think what's really, really interesting for us in Web3 is that as the technology changes that, the kind of the key component of Web3 is a coordination system, right? It's a common source of truth, it's a common ledger, it's a way of connecting fragmented pieces into a common narrative. And I think that's what's really interesting about the space we're in.
I love it. That's great. Final words. We've got 2 minutes left.
Yeah, so just in the lobby, we'll be around for a little while, and we've got some stuff we can give out and get you on your journey to start your story with us. If anyone wants to come and ask any questions, we've got some digital merch and also physical merch that we can hand out. If you want to learn a little bit more about the storytelling that we're doing in our game and learn more about the Wax blockchain, then come and see us. And Level 5, the Atomic Hub booth that's there as well. They're the biggest marketplace on Wax, and they'll be able to get you started as well.
Definitely will do that. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.